Go ahead and start. I know a lot of people usually come in a little bit after we start, but that's fine. I just want to thank you all for coming to the MIT Center for International Starr Forum on Iran. We're delighted to have with us 4 experts on U.S.-Iran relations, including Barry Posen, who I'm honored to introduce. Barry Posen is Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT, Director of the Center's Security Studies Program, and serves on the Executive Committee of Seminar 21, an educational program for senior military officers, government officials, and business executives in the national security policy world. Professor Posen is widely published and expert on subjects including a nuclear Iran and the Iraq War. His current research interests include U.S. national security policy, the security policy of the European Union, the organization and employment of military force, great power intervention into civil conflicts, and innovation of the U.S. Army. He recently testified before Congress on a new grand strategy for the Obama administration. We're delighted that he is here to chair tonight's discussion and have asked that he introduce our additional distinguished speakers. One quick reminder, though, before we get started. For the Q&A with the audience, please use the mics in the aisles so we can hear your questions and capture the audio for our video. Now, please join me in welcoming Barry Posen.
Well, for a glorified traffic cop, I got a pretty good introduction there. I appreciate that, Michelle. My mission here today is basically to keep order, and I think with such a good group, it will not be hard. I'm going to introduce the speakers just before they speak rather than all at once so that we can get right into sort of the meat of the thing. And the speakers have drawn lots for who goes first, Suzanne, you're going to go first today, is that correct?
Yeah,
yes. So first I'll say a little bit about Suzanne, and then she can talk to you a little bit about what's on her mind this afternoon. She's Director of Policy Studies at the Asia Society, and one of her main focuses is U.S. policy towards Iran. She's directed dialogues with partners in the Middle East and Asia on regional security, on nuclear proliferation, on peace operations, and in global governance. She joined the Asia Society in September 2007. As the Director of Policy Studies, she's been focusing on a whole set of challenges in the Asian region, and she's leading projects on problems across the region, not just Iran, but also on Burma and on water security in Asia and on emerging international institutions in Asia. Prior to this position, she was a Vice President of Global Policy Programs at the United Nations Association, which it is, as its title suggests. Between 2002 and 2007, she directed a Track 2 U.S.-Iran dialogue, so she has a lot of depth and background that she can bring to bear on the conversation this afternoon, so I'm going to turn the podium right over to you.
Thanks so much, Barry. First, let me thank Jim Walsh for inviting me here today. I've admired Jim for many years now and his work on the nuclear issue, and
I think you have to punch the button.
Is it working now?
It's only at MIT that we have these technical problems.
How about now? Better? Well, since that was the most important thing I was going to say, I'd better repeat it. I wanted to thank Jim Walsh for inviting me here today. I've known Jim for many years now. I really respect his work on what he's done on the nuclear issue, and I think it offers a glimmer of hope in an otherwise somewhat pessimistic view. And also, I'm very pleased to be on the same panel with Stephen Heintz. Stephen was one of my earliest supporters when I went down the road of Track 2 dialogue with Iran, and these years later, we still have much to talk about, so thanks, Stephen. What I would like to do is just give a brief assessment of where I think the Obama administration is at with its Iran policy. As a candidate for the American presidency, we of course know Barack Obama was very adamant about, if he were to be elected, he would change course on Iran and pursue direct diplomatic engagement with the powers that be in Tehran without preconditions. And this was one of the few points of difference in the area of foreign policy that he had with his then rival, Hillary Clinton, who of course is now Secretary of State. As president, Obama immediately ordered a review of Iran policy, but the starting point was not whether or not to negotiate with Iran. That debate was laid to rest. Instead, the review has focused on when and how to engage Iran, identifying areas of common interest, and thinking through how to manage the very profound differences that exists between the two governments. Over the past 100 days plus into his presidency, we have witnessed what I would call a clear and steady shift away from the Bush administration's policy of shunning direct engagement with Tehran. This new course has centered on viewing diplomacy not as a reward, but as an important tool to advance U.S. foreign policy. This has been guided by the realization that without some measure of cooperation from Iran, there is no way to address the most vexing issues the United States faces in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, including Iraq, Afghanistan, nonproliferation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and energy security in the Gulf. As expected, the reaction from Iran has been one of skepticism and caution and even outright dismissiveness. Iranian officials have said that they are waiting to see if the Obama administration is serious about changing U.S. policies. They have done their best to play down the new U.S. approach and have characterized it as simply a toning down in rhetoric and nothing more than a change in language. But I think that a review of developments to date point to a profound shift in U.S. policy that goes well beyond just a change in language and tinkerings at the margins. I'd like to outline what I think are the most concrete examples of this shift. First, the nuclear issue. First and foremost, the Obama administration has recognized Iran's right to a peaceful nuclear program. It's dropped the precondition of requiring Iran to suspend its nuclear enrichment activities in order to begin direct talks on the nuclear issue. Administration officials announced in April that the United States would start participating regularly with other major powers in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. It extended an invitation to Iran to join in a new round of talks within the mechanism of the P5+1, which would include Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China. William Burns, the State Department's third highest ranking diplomat, has been designated as the U.S. representative in these negotiations. Additionally, the administration has indicated it is agreeable to discussing all issues of concern to both countries in a broad-based dialogue. For the Iranians, this is a very important point. Tehran is not interested in talks focused on a single issue only, particularly if that issue is the nuclear issue. Their fear is that once a single issue is resolved, especially the nuclear issue, the Americans will then claim victory and end the talks and essentially cut them off. The second development I wanted to focus on was what I would call a refraining from interfering in domestic issues. Since Barack Obama assumed the presidency, all talk of regime change has come to a grinding halt. This stands in sharp contrast to the previous administration. In his State of the Union addresses, his speeches before the UN General Assembly and other venues, President Bush attempted to use these opportunities to drive a wedge between the government of Iran and the people of Iran. His 2006 State of the Union address contained a barely veiled call for regime change in Iran, directly appealing to the Iranian people to win your freedom. President Obama addressed his videotaped Nowruz message in March to the leaders and the people in Iran together. He also referred to the country as the Islamic Republic of Iran, a recognition that the IRI is the legitimate government of the country, and he did not once mention the word regime. Moreover, members of the administration are refraining from commenting on the upcoming presidential election in Iran, which is set to take place on June 12th. Here again, we see the administration approaching Iran as the Islamic Republic of Iran as a legitimate and unified government, and resisting attempts to play one leader or candidate or faction off of another. This is a major departure from previous U.S. attempts to play on internal political dynamics in Iran, all of which proved to be counterproductive. The third development I'd like to spend a moment on is the curtailing of U.S. support for Iranian opposition groups. The U.S. Treasury Department recently designated the Free Life Party of Kurdistan, also known as PJAK, as a terrorist organization. PJAK is operating on the border region between Iraq and Iran, and in the fall of 2008, there were reports that the U.S. was funding PJAC to fight a proxy war against Iran. With this move, U.S. funding of PJAC, whether alleged or real, has come to an end. The fourth development is Afghanistan. During his first visit to Afghanistan in February as the new U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke stated that Iran has a vital role to play in helping to stabilize the war-torn country. He went on to recognize Iran's, quote, legitimate role in the region. A month later, Ambassador Holbrooke reached out to Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Mohammad Mehdi Akhundzadeh at the International Conference on Afghanistan, which was held at The Hague on March 31st. This encounter constituted the Obama administration's first face-to-face contact with Iran. More recently, Ambassador Holbrooke chatted briefly with Iran's Foreign Minister Motaki at a Pakistan Donors Conference in Tokyo just a few weeks ago. Such interactions were unthinkable just a year ago, and Iran ended up pledging over $300 million in aid to Pakistan at that conference, something Tehran could have just as easily done in a bilateral gesture to Pakistan. Here I'd just like to spend a few more minutes on Afghanistan because I think this is where we're seeing perhaps the most important shifts in a sustained effort. It appears that the Obama administration is viewing Afghanistan as a logical point of entry for U.S.-Iranian re-engagement. This seems to be a wise move, arguably because Afghanistan represents the place where there currently is the greatest intersection of U.S.-Iranian common interests. The Iranians view the situation in Afghanistan as a matter of national security. Iran is deeply affected by drug trafficking and insurgencies along the Iran-Afghanistan border, and it is paying in both blood and treasure. The Iranians recognize that ensuring stability in Afghanistan, halting the spread of radical fundamentalism, and controlling narcotics trafficking are shared interests both countries have. While careful not to rule out future cooperation, the Iranians I have talked to in informal meetings have consistently emphasized that Iran was badly burned the last time it extended a helpful hand to the United States on Afghanistan. They contend that the formation of the government in Kabul and the new constitution would not have been possible without their cooperation. But the result was being labeled part of the axis of evil by the Bush administration. Getting beyond these deeply held feelings of humiliation and mistrust will require an enormous effort. The Iranians have a number of concerns in Afghanistan. While they welcome the broader regional approach that the U.S. is pursuing there, at the same time they are faced with a growing U.S. troop presence along their border. And what is NATO doing in Afghanistan, they ask. Yes, they recognize the effort to help the Afghan people, but as Iranians, they think about Iranian national security first. Going forward, what would be important for the Iranians? I think they believe that a military approach to Afghanistan will not solve the problems there. Instead, they want to see a political solution pursued through regional cooperation as the way forward. The approach must go beyond military aspects and also tackle economic and social development, reconstruction, and so forth. It is likely that they would be amenable to joining a re-established contract group on Iran with the participation of Afghanistan's neighbors and other governments with a role to play. So this could be a starting point for engagement from which to build on mutual interests. Another major concern for the Iranians on Afghanistan is the Taliban. And the concern that the Obama administration will enter into negotiations with the Taliban to bring about a political settlement there. As the Iranians say, they do not see a good Taliban and a bad Taliban. They see it as an ideology. They fault us, U.S. administration officials, for seeing the Taliban as a political group or party, much like the IRA. So this is one issue that may be a potential hurdle to getting to a cooperative mode. Looking at the way forward, what I think is needed now is an approach that engages Iran in a direct and sustained way to clarify U.S. intentions in the region while building confidence and trust. Such an approach will require each side to exercise great restraint, and distrust will continue. There's no question about it. Setbacks will be frequent, but the results over time could lead to greater mutual understanding and a learned capacity to make progress on some of the most pressing issues in the region. The common interests are clear in Afghanistan. Both countries support the stability and development of Afghanistan. They both support the defeat of a resurgent and militant Taliban. They both support the eradication of the country's opium crop, which has contributed to Iran's growing problems with heroin addiction and the spread of HIV/AIDS. So over these past 4 months, I think the Obama administration has been carefully and steadily laying the groundwork for direct negotiations with Iran. The senior officials speaking on behalf of the administration have been consistent in using language that is both principled and respectful, and there's coherence in the diplomatic outreach to U.S. allies and others to garner support for this course of action, and also a coherence in outreach to reassure those who are concerned that a normalization in U.S.-Iran relations would not come at their expense. So I think we're on our way to seeing the development of a full-fledged strategy. We're not there yet by any means, but the approach is in sharp contrast to the previous administration, which frankly never got beyond a series of tactics, mainly centered around sanctions. The other important aspect of this new approach is leadership. It's a key ingredient to making progress on any issue we engage Iran on. It must be a strategic decision taken at the very top of the leadership of both countries and help to create an atmosphere for collaboration. So I think on the U.S. side, we're almost there. The Iranian side has yet to be revealed. So in essence, I think the new administration is on the right track towards demonstrating that it's serious in ushering a new era in U.S.-Iran relations. Essentially, the dance has begun. But obviously, this is a dance that does require a partner. So far, Iranian officials have been saying the change in tone, a change in America's tone is positive, but there hasn't been concrete action. But my concern is that this is a window of opportunity for the Iranians that could close rather quickly. And it seems that the ball is now squarely in Tehran's court to respond. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and thanks for staying right on the clock. That was terrific. Now I'd like to introduce Jim Walsh. I really shouldn't have to read an introduction to Jim. Jim is a member of the Security Studies Program. When I'm looking particularly forlorn, he looks at me and says, "What's up, boss?" And he's the only person who ever calls me boss. So it's terrific to have him there to watch for my moods. Jim has worked on proliferation for as long as I think I've known him, and that's some years now. He's worked on it here, and he's worked on it at the Kennedy School. In recent years, he's been particularly good at reaching out to both the North Koreans and the Iranians, and he's been to these countries. He's talked to their officials. He's gotten inside their decision-making processes to the extent that anyone can. More recently, Jim, with several colleagues, and I think collaborating with many other groups, has been advancing an idea about how to organize enrichment in Iran that would both satisfy the Iranians' natural sovereignty kinds of concerns about a full fuel cycle, and at the same time assure that the full fuel cycle could not be adapted for nefarious purposes. So it's a great delight for me to introduce Jim once again, as I often get to do, and to hear a progress report on what's going on in this dangerous part of the world. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Barry. Can you hear me? Yes? Good. And I also want to thank Dick Samuels and John Tierman and Michelle for organizing this event, and all of you for being willing to come out on a rainy day to hear us talk about this topic, a favorite of ours anyway. I'm going to try to address three questions. Where are we? Where are we going, and are we going to get there? And as far as the first question goes, where are we? I think Suzanne has provided a terrific summary of the significant differences in style and approach the Obama administration has adopted in these, and we have to remind ourselves, first 3 months of a new term. If you ask me where are U.S.-Iranian relations, I would say they're better than they've been in years, but of course that's a really low threshold. Where we're really at is at the preliminary stage, the scene setting. People, and particularly this administration, has taken a number of steps, Suzanne referred to several of them, that might develop in the future towards a positive trend line in U.S.-Iranian relations. But we don't know that that's going to happen yet because we really are at the very beginning. In addition to the points that Suzanne mentioned in terms of dropping the precondition for negotiations, the New Year's video, and the other steps that the Obama administration has taken, I would also point out that I think it's been helpful that these last 2 weeks Secretary Gates has been in the public and in no uncertain terms has discouraged Israel from contemplating a preemptive military strike or a preventive military strike on Iranian facilities, and is doing so on the eve of a visit from the Israeli leadership. I think this new approach that Obama lays out is not only a matter of ideology, although I think there's certainly an ideological component, but it also reflects real American interests. Obama comes to his term, comes to the office hoping to get out of Iraq and trying to stabilize Afghanistan. It's going to be difficult for him. I have great powers. You better be careful. It's going to be difficult for him to get out of Iraq smoothly, for Iraq to see our withdrawal and to maintain stability and to achieve our aims in Afghanistan without a cooperative or at least a working civil relationship with Iran. So there's reason for the policy change beyond probably a dedication to diplomacy or a particular worldview. And I would reemphasize something that I think Suzanne mentioned. I think, from what I hear from friends who are working in the administration, that President Obama is personally involved. And I think that's going to be all the difference in the world. It's hard to imagine that he can be personally involved when he has Iraq and Afghanistan, a world economic crisis, and everything else. But he's not leaving this to the bureaucracy. I think if he left it to the bureaucracy, we'd get pretty much the same old, plus or minus 10%. 10% on sanctions, 10% on incentives, whatever. But I think he is, and I am told, he is personally involved in this process, and I think that's going to be important if we hope to have success over the medium and long term. Now, Iran, for its part, I think Suzanne is right to say that they're cautious. I think that there are two minds. The Iranians are of two minds on Obama. I was in Tehran the week of the U.S. presidential election for meetings, and even reading the English language press, the Tehran Times, which is not going to be your reformist press that you get at your hotel, at your state-owned hotel. You can tell even in the government press a certain schizophrenia about Obama. There was almost an emotional feeling that Obama could represent a significant change, a real change in U.S.-Iranian relations, a hopefulness about that, and an interest and curiosity about him as a personality. At the same time, the head was saying, no, Democrats and Republicans are the same, they all pass sanctions resolutions, our foreign policy is controlled by Israel, whatever the normal litany of Iranian complaints about U.S. leadership would be, they would all apply to Obama anyway. So you had both hope and skepticism, and I think that continues to characterize the Iranian scene. And we've seen it play out in Iran's current presidential election, which is on June 12th, and we'll probably have a runoff after that. This is an election that's going to be based primarily on the economy. It's the economy stupid, 2009. But both candidates, or not both, several of the candidates are vying to be elected and arguing that they would be the better president in dealing with the United States, that they would pursue a more cooperative rather than confrontational approach to U.S.-Iranian relations. And this is true not only of Karoubi, but also of Mousavi, who's sort of a reformer conservative mix, but even Rezai, who is a principalist, who is a conservative, an establishment guy, a guy who ran the Revolutionary Guard for 16 years. He's General Secretary of the Expediency Council, someone I've met with, and he's in the press saying that he would be less confrontational. He would get Iran out of the headlines. We don't need to talk about the Holocaust. And Iran should not wait to act on the U.S. relationship. It should take initiative in trying to improve the U.S.-Iranian relationship. All of this is backhanded criticism of Ahmadinejad, who himself has mellowed during the presidential campaign somewhat in terms of his rhetoric about U.S.-Iranian relations. So I think the Obama effect is already beginning to resonate through Iranian politics, at least in what statements are being made during the presidential election. At the end of the day, though, it's not going to be about the president, although I think the president can be important. It's about the supreme leader. This is a theocracy. The supreme leader calls the shots. He's not the day-to-day policy actors, pressing this button and that button. But there's going to be no major change in Iranian foreign policy unless it's approved by the supreme leader. And he comes to this relationship with a deep skepticism about U.S. motives and U.S. past behavior. Now, both sides, when I meet with U.S. officials in Washington, at the State Department, in the White House, or when I meet with Iranian officials, I hear exactly the same thing. Both tell me they want a change. They want a better relationship with the other, but they're deeply skeptical that the other side is serious. It is almost verbatim what I hear, verbatim and being identical, that both say they want change and both doubts the sincerity of the other. Both feel like they've been burned by the other. Iran feels like it helped the U.S. During the war in Afghanistan, with the war in Iraq, and then got slapped despite its help. And then the U.S. feels like Iran is, particularly on the nuclear issue, but on others, has engaged in deception and concealment. So and has been played. So both feel a sense of having been hurt, wronged by the other side, and a deep suspicion about motives. So that's where we're at. A preliminary stage that feels good and looks positive, but with serious skepticism not lingering right behind those early good feelings. So where are we going? I think Suzanne is absolutely right that we're heading towards tactical cooperation, first on Afghanistan and the related issue of the Afghan drug trade. That's what Iranians tell me is the place to start on cooperative action. That's what U.S. officials tell me their intentions are. I think the U.S. wisely realizes you can't start with the nuclear issue. At the end of the day, U.S.-Iranian relations for the U.S. will be centrally about the nuclear issue. But it may be the most important issue, but it's not necessarily the best place to start. And I think the Obama administration has decided, let's start on these other issues, let's build a little trust, let's get a little momentum, and then in parallel or in sequence begin to deal with the nuclear issue. The Obama administration has a fundamental decision, and I'm not sure how they've resolved it. It's not clear that the policy review has been complete. The fundamental decision is, do we continue to have the same policy objective as the Bush administration, which was zero enrichment on Iranian soil, no centrifuges? Let me remind you that Iran has now built and installed some 6,500 centrifuges, and despite along this path to 6,500, and it will increase, our policy has always been 0, 0, 0. You need to dismantle and remove those centrifuges. Now, the Obama administration may speak with a nicer tone, it may offer greater incentives, it may show respect, but if at the end of the day it insists on zero centrifuges, then I think we're going to end up in the same policy situation or same policy outcome that we had before. That's my own view. So the issue that they are wrestling with, and I think they are actively wrestling with it, is whether to continue the same policy objective of zero centrifuges on Iranian soil, or whether to entertain what I call non-zero options. A non-zero option might be a multinationally run enrichment facility. It might be an Iranian-run enrichment facility, but with enhanced safeguards and transparency, new sets of rules, that sort of thing that would give the world community greater confidence about Iran's intentions. But whatever form it may take, that's the fundamental issue. Allowing some enrichment or insisting on zero enrichment. And I think that remains to be seen. That will have a lot to do with whether we're successful in improving relations or not. Now, there will be some developments that will emerge over the next several months that will help shape where we end up going. One of those will be the presidential election. Now, again, I think at the end of the day, the supreme leader is the man. He is, in the words of George Bush, the decider. But I think it's also worth pointing out that personalities and individuals matter. President Ahmadinejad, whatever you may think of him, has definitely shaped the office of the presidency, has expanded the scope of that office through dint of personality and appointments and prerogative, has made his made something out of the office in a way that Hatami, more reserved, less, how can I put it, less outgoing personality, I'll say, less strong personality, at least publicly, was unable to do with a supreme leader who was skeptical of his intentions and his policies. So if we get a new president, the supreme leader will still be the most important decider, but it could nevertheless have an impact. I don't expect Rezai to win, but Rezai is a conservative. He's a principalist, and he has told me that on the nuclear issue, he would be open to an international consortium. I've spoken to other anti-Ahmadinejad conservatives, establishment conservatives, who are open to the idea of freeze for freeze or other compromises that might help resolve or at least get us going towards some momentum on the nuclear issue. So the presidential election matters, and it matters what the nature of the results. If it is a landslide for one party or another, I think that will affect the supreme leader. People talk about Iran as being authoritarian or dictatorial. Public opinion matters. They have elections in which you have surprise winners, and public opinion matters even to the supreme leader. And if there is a rejection of Ahmadinejad, I don't expect this to happen, but if there were a landslide for another candidate, the supreme leader would have to pay attention to that. Alternatively, if Ahmadinejad wins in a landslide, that's going to have significance and meaning for the supreme leader as well. Regardless, I think we can expect that the economy is going to continue to be a problem for Iran. We're not going to. They're going to get through this election, but whoever is president is going to walk into that office and inherit a bundle of economic problems revolving around the issue of the price of oil and their reserves. And I think, regardless of who's president, we're in for a period of negotiation, and that this is going to take time. I don't expect real substantive movement for months. We're talking months or a year. We're not talking weeks. And all the while, Iran will continue to build centrifuges. That number at 6,500 is going to go to 7,000. It's going to go to 8,000. And as that number steadily increases, the pressure for the U.S. to do something, military action, draconian sanctions, something, that pressure is going to increase over time. So I think the Obama administration faces a big dilemma, and I think they get it. I think they understand that they have this dilemma. On the one hand, they would like to build confidence, move slowly, play with carrots and sticks at the margins, use non-zero options as a fallback position rather than an initial position, go to that only if they have to. But Obama is a wasting asset. His poll numbers at home and abroad are only going to go down over time. Absent some external shock, they're only going to go down over time, and you're only a virgin once. It's going to be very difficult for him to adopt the same policy objectives as were previously the case, zero enrichment, what have you. And then, after having been perceived as just another American, like all the other Americans, not really different, not really a change, then to try to come back and recoup that from a politically weaker position, and then suddenly say, oh, well, I have this other alternative. I think the best chance of success for improved U.S.-Iranian relations is going to be if Obama acts early and boldly while he still has the power of public opinion domestically and internationally, while he's still perceived as authentically different and new. That's not going to last forever. And the weaker it becomes, the more difficult I think it will be for him to accomplish his objectives. So let me conclude with just 1 minute on, will we get there? And I am, as Barry knows, a hardwired optimist. But I think if you look at the empirical record, you would not have a lot of confidence. I think Obama has an excellent shot. But this is a relationship in which there are differences of interests, and it's a relationship whose history has been characterized by missed opportunities. One side extends a hand, the other is not ready. The other side extends a hand, and that one isn't ready. And you cannot underestimate mistrust as a corrosive dynamic that is a major impediment here. If you fundamentally doubt the partner or the other side when you're engaged in negotiations, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to get the momentum that will lead you to be able to make progress in the intermediate term. There's opposition in both countries to improve relations. There's opposition in the Arab world, in Israel, and in Russia to better U.S.-Iranian relations. There are ingrained beliefs that will be difficult to overcome. We all talk about Iran's nuclear weapons program, the active nuclear weapons program, despite the fact that the intelligence head of U.S. intelligence continues to this day to testify that they believe that Iran has suspended the military work on its nuclear program, but everyone keeps talking about it as if that wasn't true. So ingrained beliefs, and of course there are going to be the unforeseen crises and events that can derail or perhaps even facilitate a move towards better relations. So I think we're at a preliminary stage. I think the Iranian election is going to prove to be important. I think we have a shot at improving relations, but the smart money is probably going to bet against it. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you, Jim. As you know, I have my bet down. Our last speaker and the commentator on both of these presentations is Stephen Heintz. He's the president of the Rockefeller Bros Fund. He's held leadership positions in both the nonprofit and the public sectors. He joined RBF in February 1st of 2001. Before that, he was the founding president of an organization called Demos, a network of ideas in action, a new public policy research organization. Earlier in his career, he was a cabinet official in the state of Connecticut. So if we get to the question of the domestic politics of the United States of all these concessions, I'm sure he'll have something very interesting to say. So welcome, and thanks for coming up for this.
Barry, thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Yes? Okay, good. Well, I'm also delighted to be here, and thanks to MIT for organizing this. I want to say how much fun it's been to listen to both Suzanne and Jim, as it always is. We've been working together very closely for a number of years now, and I think you will find us largely in agreement on many points, but not entirely. And that's because this is a very complicated issue. And I will offer just a few thoughts, and then I think we really all are very interested in hearing from you and your points of view and your questions. First, I think we need to start from the question, why is this important? It's not important, in my view, because we think Iran is such a wonderful country. I think the people and the history and the culture of Iran are wonderful, truly extraordinary. And I've had the pleasure of visiting briefly in Iran last year, and it is a spectacular place. It is not a system of government that we have a lot of admiration for. It is still a very repressive regime. Human rights are still a major problem. And so we're not interested in this issue because we think Iran is a great government with which to deal. We are interested in this because the United States has very clear national interests that are at stake. And that's the reason to engage with Iran. And they go beyond. Jim ticked off a couple of them, and those are very clear and obvious, Afghanistan being one and Iraq being another. But it gets to Middle East peace, it gets to the war on terror, it gets to regional stability, it gets to energy and oil supply. So, I mean, there are just a whole host of issues that if you look at a map of the Middle East, Iran is really in the center of a set of issues that are of direct national interest to the United States. Conversely, I think Iran is increasingly beginning to see that some kind of a relationship with the great Satan is also in their national interest. And in fact, that's going to be the key determinant of whether the supreme leader, who will ultimately make the judgment about whether and how deep to engage with the United States, and he said this very clearly last January of 2008, that the United States and Iran need not have a permanent relationship of enmity, that there can be a shift in the relationship when it is in the national interest of Iran. And I, as supreme leader, will make that judgment. So this is all about national interests, and that's why we're engaged in this. Now, part of the big challenge we've got coming to this is that while we're each trying to figure out our national interests and trying to understand to the best of our knowledge what the other side's national interests are, and then looking for points of intersection, as well as the points where we are really diametrically opposed, the problem is we have very little knowledge of each other. We don't know each other at all. Very few Americans have contact with Iranians. Since 1979, very few Iranians have contact with us. We used to have thousands of Iranian students here at MIT and at Harvard and other universities all across this country, many of whom are now people back in Iran serving in government and in other positions. But we have very little knowledge. We have no presence on the ground. We have very little intelligence capability on the ground in Iran. So we have very, very little knowledge, and they have very little knowledge of us, which only serves to reinforce what both Suzanne and Jim have said, which is a relationship based on suspicion, paranoia, and a sense of humiliation. The Iranians feel that their whole experience with the West since the Second World War has been an experience of humiliation, one thing after another. First the British, then the Russians, then the Americans. Obviously, we have our own experience of humiliation that is still very much a potent political memory for this country, and that's the hostage crisis of 1979 that went on for 444 days. So we have this paranoia, we have this suspicion, we have this sense of humiliation. These are two powers, two countries that think of themselves as great countries. Iran thinks of itself as one of the longest civilizations in history, with a very proud cultural tradition, and it is. We think of ourselves as an exceptional country. There's a lot been said about American exceptionalism. So we come at this with all this baggage, we come at it with a really deep lack of knowledge, and we come at it with our own sense of national interests evolving and our own understanding of what Iranian national interests are also beginning to shift. So that's the context. Then we have the political environment. We have a very dynamic political environment in Iran, far more dynamic than most casual observers of Iran understand. There is a lot of contention. There's a lot of pluralism. There are many factions. They're not necessarily competing over a vast difference of ideology, but they certainly are competing over power, as most politics is ultimately about. And that dynamism is also very hard to predict. We all were meeting on a regular basis with a group of Iranians over a 6-year period, and in 2005, halfway through this process, we were meeting with our colleagues in Sweden in between the first round of national elections and the runoff, and nobody in the Iranian group had any sense that this guy Ahmadinejad was going to turn up to be the victor. This was out of the question. So it was a surprise to a lot of Iranians. It probably was not a surprise to the supreme leader, and there are obvious ways in which he can influence the outcome of the electoral process. But it is a dynamic, competitive process, and that, too, we need to respect and understand. Same as our process is very competitive, and if President Obama does settle on a course of action and begins to implement it, he is not, although he is our top leader, he obviously has a lot of politics to contend with in our country as well. There are a lot of people in Congress, a lot of people in very powerful interest groups in Washington who are not eager to see a move to improve ties between Iran and the United States. So again, there's actually more parallel about our two societies than I think many people understand. So what does this mean is going to happen going forward? I have, a slight difference with Suzanne about where we are. I think that the Obama administration has done a superb job at creating different atmospherics. They've done a great job of changing the tone and the style of our relationship with Iran from a distance. They have said all the right things from the very beginning, from the president's inaugural message when he didn't mention Iran specifically, but he reached out to the global Muslim community in a very positive way. A few days later, to his interview on El Arabiya, where he talked about engaging with Iran on the basis of mutual respect. Later in his Nowruz message, his videotaped New Year's message to the Iranian people, which was extremely well done, very carefully crafted, and very well delivered. So I think the tone is much better, the style is much better, but I tend to agree with Jim that there is still a huge debate underway within the policy circles in the U.S. government and from the pressure groups outside the government who have a real stake in this about what the content of the U.S. policy toward Iran should or will be. And I think that debate is yet to be resolved. I think that one of the things that's not helping Obama, because I do agree with Jim that I think the president is personally deeply interested in this and committed to trying to do something that would help serve our national interests and reduce tension in the Middle East and help solve some other problems. But I think one of the problems that he's got is that so far the Iranians have sent mixed signals. There have been positive statements. Jim quoted one from Rezai recently. Ahmadinejad has even said some things that were less negative than he normally says. Others have said things. Larijani, the speaker of their Majlis, has said some, from time to time, encouraging things. But there's been no real sense of welcoming of the Obama initiative. And in fact, there have been other things that have happened in the same period of time that have been counter evidence, like the ongoing arrests of American Iranians in Iran, and obviously the most recent case of the reporter who's now in prison facing 7 years on an espionage charge. So that's not a particularly helpful signal to send at a time when we're trying to improve relations. Now, some argue that that's going to end up being a card, and that at some point in the near future they will release her, and that will be a gesture to say, look, we really are open, and that maybe this whole thing was kind of orchestrated. One never knows. But we're in a very difficult period. I agree with Jim, there isn't much time for this if we're really going to make progress. So what can we expect going forward? Well, not much in the very near future. Certainly not much until after the June 12th elections and whatever runoff may occur after that. And then after that, I think we'll begin to see a series of fairly modest steps. I don't think we're going to see, and I had conversations as recently as the last 3 days with people in the government in Washington about this, and I do not think that we're going to see the announcement of some major new policy toward Iran, some coherent policy with 10 steps and a kind of a major shift. I think we'll see steps instead, little steps to begin with, leading hopefully toward larger ones. So what will they be? Well, I do think we'll see the beginning, as Suzanne said, the restarting of the P5+1 multilateral talks, and I think that will be positive. I'm hoping that we will begin to see contacts in Islamabad and Kabul between U.S. diplomats and Iranian diplomats, because those are two countries where Iran and U.S. interests are very, very close, if not identical. Iran has to be deeply concerned about what's happening in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, as we are as well. The drug trade, the future of the nuclear weapons of Pakistan, the harboring of terrorists, the possible reemergence of the Taliban as the controlling powers. I mean, these things are all of deep, deep concern to Iran as well. So I think there will be increasing links between U.S. diplomats in those spheres and Iranian diplomats in those spheres. If those steps begin to show some progress, and if people can be patient, and I said this recently to somebody in the White House, kind of facetiously, but the message I think is really a fundamental one. When dealing with the supreme leader, we are going to have to show supreme patience. And it's because of the fact that this relationship has been so bad for so long, we have so little knowledge of them, they have so little knowledge of us, there's lots of paranoia, lots of fear, and lots we don't like about them. And we're not going to resolve this overnight, and if we go into the negotiations or into a process of dialogue or engagement thinking, if we don't get a grand bargain in 3 months, it's back to carrots and sticks, we are doomed to fail. It's going to be a process at times that are going to feel like 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and maybe at other times 1.5 steps forward and only 1 step back. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take patience, and it's going to take a real effort to understand where they're coming from and to communicate effectively where we're coming from, and to try to find those elements where we can work together. So I hope our political system and their political system has enough tolerance and resilience to give the space for real diplomacy. And I think we have to think back on the darkest days of the Cold War and remember that during all that time, when there was a much graver threat to the security of the United States coming from the Soviet Union that could be quantified in the thousands of nuclear missiles that were targeted at our cities, and vice versa, that throughout that whole time, when relations went up and down, and at times when they were on the brink of Armageddon, we never did not have diplomatic relations. We never stopped talking. We never stopped engaging. And I think it was because we engaged all through that process that we avoided some of the worst nightmares that one could have imagined resulting from the Cold War. And ultimately, the Soviet Union collapsed, and history has been what it is. So there's a very important lesson in all of that, which is the importance of diplomacy, the importance of sticking with it, the importance of consistency. We're on a good start. Now we have to follow up the change in style and tone with real change in substance And then perhaps we'll get somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is open for question, and I basically have this terrific glare in my eyes, so that even people I know I may not actually be able to recognize. So I'm probably going to do some point and shoot kind of selection of questioners. So can I see some hands, and we'll see if we can start something.
At the mics. There are 2 mics.
Oh, there are 2 mics.
Yeah.
Look, there are 2 mics.
And here comes our first.
All right.
Now, I've never been to Iran, so I'm going to ask you to deal with an uninformed bundle of ignorance and prejudices in my questions. So first, there are 2 things that I commonly hear people talk about, and it seems impossible. One has to do with a country like Iran on a long-term basis, a country with its sense of history and sense of pride, on a long-term basis, walking away from nuclear weapons. I just can't, and so basically I want to tell me, is there really a significant chance that a culture like this can walk away from nuclear weapons, or is this all just a game managing our expectations so that when they finally do get nuclear weapons, it won't be like sort of a catastrophe? And the other prejudice is, I just can't imagine an Israeli attack. I just can't get there, regardless of how you look at it, I just can't imagine it. Is there any, and of course you're talking about biology, there's always room for total craziness, but it looks to me like a 1 in 1,000 thing. Is there really any point in thinking about this, anybody thinking about this as a serious possibility? Thank you.
I think we should be responsive so that we can go back and forth for a while.
Let me take those. Okay. Those are great questions. And if they're bundled in ignorance and bias, it's the same ignorance and bias that envelops most policymakers who are struggling with this issue. I think the notion that Iran is determined to get nuclear weapons, that it's inevitable that they're going to get nuclear weapons, is a widespread view. It is also reflective of one of the fundamental fallacies of the nuclear age. From 1945 on, there have been predictions that nuclear weapons would spread, that country X, it was inevitable that they were going to get nuclear weapons. And time again, that has turned out not to be the case, for different reasons. But if anything, we've overestimated the rate at which countries would acquire nuclear weapons. And luckily, the surprise has been they've not proven as popular as predicted. I think of Iran as a normal country in the nuclear age. I think, like every other of the 30 countries that were interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, of which 20 or so started down the path, stopped, and reversed course, that it's a country in which there are constituencies that want nuclear weapons, and they want to build them soon. There's a constituency that says, no, we don't want to build a nuclear weapon now. That would be too costly. We don't need it. But let's have the option. Maybe events would warrant it later on. It'd be nice to have, so why don't we hedge? And others who say, no, we shouldn't have nuclear weapons. In the common sort of policy talk or on Fox and CNN and on the news, it's a working assumption, it's an unspoken assumption that they're going for the bomb and that's been a decision. I've spent most of my scholarly career looking at countries, how they make decisions about nuclear weapons. And my own view is they have not yet made a command decision. It is still playing out in the bureaucracy. It is still something that is a possibility, but that has not been resolved. I do not believe they have made a decision. The Supreme Leader says, we're going to build them. And until they do that, there is room to play, and there is the possibility of putting them on a different trajectory, where they maintain their non-nuclear weapon status. And again, I repeat, the finding of the National Intelligence Estimate in November of 2007, reaffirmed by the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, last month in testimony to Congress, is that Iran suspended the military component of its nuclear weapons program in the fall of 2003, and as of the spring of 2007, had not restarted it. That Blair goes on to say that he thinks, and this is almost a direct quote, that at a minimum, they're keeping the option open. Close attention to what he didn't say. He didn't say they've made a decision. They're determined to get it. He said they're keeping, at a minimum, they're keeping the option open. So our intel community, as aside from our political leadership for the most part, remains agnostic on the nuclear question in terms of Iran. There's definitely interest. There's definitely a constituency for it. It's not clear at all that that constituency will prevail and that will be a policy that leads to a natural conclusion. On the Israeli attack...
Before we go to Israel, I just want to add one thought about the nuclear issue. There's a way in which these two things are really linked together. On the one hand, I think the answer to your question is yes, it's possible to convince Iran not to have nuclear weapons. On the other hand, I don't think it's possible to convince Iran not to have nuclear energy. And in fact, if we try to force Iran not to have nuclear energy, we will create more incentives for them to have nuclear weapons. And I think that's a key part of this process. And so we have to find a way to live with Iran as a nuclear power state in order that we reduce the probability that it becomes a nuclear weapon state. And that's, I think, the policy challenge we've got.
I couldn't agree more with that. You got to be careful about the assumptions that you have. If you assume that Iran is bound and determined to get a nuclear weapon, then that's going to lead you to various policy choices, some of which will actually provide incentives for Iran to go ahead and choose nuclear weapons in ways that they might not otherwise have chosen had you had a different assumption. If we were to strike their nuclear facilities, I think that pretty much guarantees they're going to build a nuclear weapon. That's one of the consequences of that sort of decision. Now, if they're already planning to do it, then you can have an argument about whether that's good or not, because if they're going to do it anyway, at least you're delaying them. Well, there's some cost, but you can have a reasonable conversation about that. But if they haven't decided yet whether to become a nuclear weapon state, and you go in and attack them, you're increasing the probability that, in fact, that outcome you're trying to avoid is, in fact, the one that you will produce by your actions.
Can I follow up myself here? There still is this mystery in the NIE, which I actually just read it earlier today for another reason, and that is the implication of the NIE is that sometime prior to 2003, they had a nuclear weapons program, and it was an intended nuclear weapons program.
Yes.
And then they decided to turn that nuclear weapons program off.
Yes.
So, what do we know about the program that existed prior to 2003? Why it existed? And how do we think about the problem of the policy community as not being exactly the one that you laid out, but the problem of deciding which Iran should we take the most seriously? Mm-hmm. The one that turned the weapons program on, or the one that turned the weapons program off?
Absolutely. The NIE, when I appear on Iranian TV, they love to talk about the fact that the NIE says that they don't have a nuclear weapons program. They never talk about the fact that the NIE said they did have a nuclear weapons program prior to 2003. And this is I think Barry's question is absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the history, I personally believe that the Shah was interested in having nuclear weapons. He expressed an interest to President Eisenhower in 1958 about acquiring nuclear weapons, and I think that program in the early 70s, while it had the veneer of being purely civilian, I have deep suspicions about the intentions of that program. And clearly they had nuclear weapons military activity later. I'm thinking, and we don't know, but late 90s. That program, it's not your typical program if you chart it. The countries that tend to be successful at building nuclear weapons focus on it like a laser. They make a decision, they focus like a laser, and they get it done, in 10 years or something. The Iranian nuclear program has gone up and down over about 25 years, but it really became focused late, and that's presumably the time around which the military began their activities. I'd say the good news about it is clearly in terms of civil-military relations, the theocracy has the power to order the military to cease and desist when it wants to, or to start up again, as you rightly raised, if it wants to. On the Israeli attack, I think people are very concerned about it, very, very, very concerned about it. And while I agree, it seemed like it would be a foolish thing to do right now, especially when you got Gaza and asymmetric threats on your border that you're already dealing with, to then sort of double up by attacking Iran. It seems like that would be a bad idea, but they clearly, French and American officials are scared to death that Israel's going to do.
I was in Israel during the Gaza war, and there's a substantial body opinion in Israel that believes that Israel had lost its deterrent capability, or its deterrent power. It's not the physical capability, but its deterrent power, deterrent influence vis-a-vis its own range of adversaries, in part due to the way the Lebanon war ended. And there's sort of a chip on the shoulder there. And you have to remember, not only did they raid Gaza with a certain vigor, but they did attack a site in Syria that they thought was associated with nuclear weapons. So I wouldn't assume that in an unconstrained world that the Israelis wouldn't decide to go ahead and do this, and I certainly wouldn't assume that they don't have the capability to do something that could be effective. It seems to me that what's going to be dispositive here is whether or not the U.S. government continues to send the Israelis very strong signals that we find an attack at this time to be very counterproductive. And we have sent those signals. Vice President Biden also made a public statement to that effect. So we're sending the strongest signal, I think, as we can. And I think the signal comes from such a high level, it would be very, very dangerous miscalculation for the Israelis to not take the signal. Do you want to get
on this question, I first started going to Iran in spring of 2005. I was last there 4 months ago and going back on Thursday. And it wasn't until I visited that I really got a sense of how strong Iranian officials' threat perception is. They live in a very tough neighborhood. They're surrounded by a growing number of American troops along their borders. There's growing destabilization in Pakistan with nuclear weapons. There's Russia. There's their erstwhile friend who they still don't trust. There's Israel. There's the U.S. naval fleet in the Persian Gulf, etc. So it's almost hard when you're there and you're talking to them, it's almost hard to believe that they haven't made the decision to take on this capability. But I agree with Jim. I don't think that decision has yet been made. But at the same time, it is clear that they want to keep the option of going that route if indeed it's necessary. The other thing that's been striking to me in these years that I've been going there is I think we have to remember that Iran did suspend its uranium enrichment activities for nearly 2 years. And that's around the time I first started going to Iran after that. And just anecdotally speaking, at that point, officials, people on the street, really believed that Iran perhaps did not need to have uranium enrichment on their own soil. But now I think the government has been rather masterful in getting public opinion on board that that is their inherent right, that that is part of who they are as a country, and that this is an attempt for the West to take that right away from them. I'm talking about a peaceful program. So now it's really difficult to go to Iran now and travel in any circles, whether it's the elite, people at the universities, regular people in the street or at the bazaars. They all want Iran to have that peaceful nuclear capacity. So I think this presents a very strong challenge for the Obama administration as they think through what indeed is possible in the nuclear field.
Okay, you've been very patient, sir.
You know, you kind of stole my question. But with living under a theocracy, how does the average person deal with their government, their policies? I mean, are they as active as we are? I mean, we tend to oppose everything or accept everything. And how does the average person, economic problems they have, what's their reaction? What do they think about America?
Well, I think with inflation, the last time I was there was hovering around 30%. Employment was peaking. Government subsidies have come to a standstill. The price of oil has plummeted. So I think the major concern is an economic one, and even friends I have, what I would call average middle-class Iranians, are having trouble putting food on the table for their families. So I think that is their first concern. The other is in terms of education and opportunities. There are many people in the university studying in Iran. In fact, there are more women today than men studying. But once they graduate, the opportunity for career and career advancement and real economic gain is minimal, and it's shrinking. In terms of the political freedoms that I think you're asking about, it's much smaller there, the space to protest, to talk out against the government. In fact, it could be detrimental. You could end up in prison or worse. So the people that I talk to, I think, first and foremost are concerned about the economics and have sort of focused on that over the political ideals. At the same time, there are people that I know in prison now in Iran for meeting with Americans like us or participating in U.S. government-sponsored programs. So the repercussions of that sort of activity, political activity, social activity, is very high. And I think in the lead up to the presidential election, which will happen next week, that has only intensified. What we're hoping to see is after the elections that would subside somewhat, but it's not clear if that will happen.
I think that it's true to say that many Iranians live a very schizophrenic lifestyle. They know that when they're outside of their homes, they have to behave in strict compliance with Sharia law and with social restrictions that are put on them and the political restrictions that are put on them. And when they're within the four walls of their own home, they behave quite differently in many respects. So it's a very schizophrenic life. There is a sense, I think, too, of kind of fatigue with politics and a fatigue with the revolution, which after all was in 1979, but this continues to think of itself as a revolutionary society. And that has some negative consequences. I don't think that despite the dissatisfaction of most Iranians with their government over economic issues and even over a lot of these social restrictions, people are deeply dissatisfied, but they are not in a mood to rebel, to rise up. This is not a pre-revolutionary situation in Iran, despite the fact that the population is very, very young, has big ambitions, would like to have more connection with the West. One thing you do feel, though, when you're walking the streets is that people really do like Americans. They come up to you, they introduce themselves. You know, I had one guy in a shop say to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from New York." And he said, "Oh, I love America. I hate your president." This was under President Bush. "I hate your president, but I love Americans." And I said, "Well, I'm not too fond of your president either, but I'm very happy to be in Iran." And people were warm and friendly, taxi drivers and people in the shops and in the bazaar. So there's a reservoir of positive feeling about Americans, I think, in the society. But it's this schizophrenic life because they can't express themselves freely politically. They can't express themselves socially unless they're in the confines of their own homes.
Shall we get another question? This young lady here. Thank you.
So I think of Iran as a pretty stable country. And I think that if it were to get nuclear weapons, if it weren't able to be dissuaded, it might act as a balancing power to Israel. Aside from, a potential attack from Israel, what might happen if Iran were to get weapons? And how might the United States deter Israel from attacking?
You got to take that one.
You want me to take?
Yes,
sure.
I do.
If Iran were to either test a weapon or assert that it thought it had weapons that worked, it would probably change politics in the region, significantly. I think you have to ask one question about the transition to that point. I mean, I think if all of the negotiations and all the plans and dreams that people have about eliciting a different path from Iran begin to fail, there's going to be a lot of activity generated in this country and in Israel and in the Arab countries of the Gulf to try and do something about this. And I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that we'll get through this period without a war. To be honest, I think it's and I think the Iranians probably know this. But let's say that for whatever reasons we do, then there's a whole series of problems that Iran's neighbors are probably going to feel and are going to want to address. They're going to be fearful that Iran is going to be a more bumptious country, secure behind a nuclear shield. There are going to be concerns about Iran's custody of its weapons. They're going to be concerned about Iran's ambitions. And measures will almost surely be set in train to try and send a message to Iran that the fact that it's a nuclear weapon state essentially opens no options for it. That's going to be the concern. So you're going to see probably efforts by America, United States of America, its allies outside the region, the neighboring states, or mostly Arab states, and the Israelis to send a series of messages to the Iranians through both word and deed that they don't have anywhere to go with these weapons. And that is fraught itself, because the Iranians themselves may, as they see the world that they've unleashed, begin to be a little bit concerned about the fact that others will be pulling together, and the Iranians may feel encircled. So there's a way in which this is not necessarily going to, in the end, make the Iranians feel more secure. They may momentarily feel more secure, but they will set events in train that may make them feel a lot less secure, and it could produce some interesting alignments. Some Israelis will argue now that the Arab states of the Gulf are very concerned about Iran, and are much more concerned about Iran than they are about Israel. And objectively speaking, from a power point of view, that should be right. That it's not necessarily true, but it should be right. And you could find relations between Israel and the Arab states actually even improve under these circumstances. I think that's the kind of thing we should expect. It may not all work. In other words, all of these outside powers don't necessarily love each other, and trying to put together a containing or deterring coalition vis-a-vis Iran is not necessarily easy. It's not necessarily going to happen, but there'll be efforts to do it, and the Iranians may not be happy with the outcome. And the other problem is you have to worry about here, and this is something that others in the panel can talk about, is that many people in the arms control community are worried about the potential of a sort of a cycle of proliferation incentives, because other countries in the region may in the first instance look to the United States for deterrence or defense, but countries often want their own capabilities. Turkey could probably become a nuclear weapon state if it wanted to from a technical point of view. Egypt probably could if it wanted to from a technical point of view. Israel, we all believe, does have nuclear weapons, but it could conceivably decide to test under these circumstances, which would be disequilibrating. The Saudis probably can't generate a capability themselves, but they have a lot of money to spend, and there's persistent rumors of feelers going out to Pakistan. So people in the arms control business do worry about a cycle of proliferation incentives, and all of those countries would be novice nuclear states in the way that Iran would be a novice nuclear state. So it might not be a particularly pretty part of the world over a decade or so. The United States and outsiders' concerns about a cycle of proliferation may make them more energetic about trying to put together some system of containment and deterrence. So an explicit Iran that's a nuclear power is going to inject quite a lot of energy into the political system in that part of the world. And I personally believe that energy can be managed, but only with a lot of sagacity and a lot of application. And it would be far better if some diplomatic scheme could be reached that would at least put some fences around the Iranian enrichment program to ensure against the possibility of its diversion into a weapons program.
Thank you. In 1950s, the democratic presidency of Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown by CIA under the auspices of national security of the U.S., that namely was the British petroleum nationalization by Mossadegh. And Later on, during the Bush regime, they threatened the hawkish elements of the regime of Bush administration, threatened Iran militarily. And recently, Obama is offering olive branch to Iranian regime, and you see that, from my point of view, they're throwing back to their face. In all of these cases, there hasn't been no or very little attention to real and long interest of Iranian people, namely to their human, civil rights and democracy in Iran. And even in this panel, we talked about everything except that one. I'm just putting in front of you one scenario that this regime, that the whole equation revolves around survival, and the way that they are dealing with it is just adjusting risk and benefits and how to respond to it. If this regime comes to the point that they want to survive and give U.S. the main thing that they want, which is not matching the real interest of Iranian regime, namely seizing the enrichment of uranium, where was going to be the place for Iranian rights and civil rights, human rights? There hasn't been any talk at this point, and definitely it's not going to be any talk at that point. Thank you.
You want to take this?
Well, I'll just quickly say I agree with you, and I think ultimately, once we get into a dialogue with Iran, and once we begin to have a relationship in which we will be able to sustain a conversation, that human rights has to be on the agenda, and it will be on the agenda. You will not see a U.S. government staying in a conversation with Iran for very long without raising that topic, and that's clear. And we've all been clear about that in all the conversations we've had with Iran as well. So you're right to be concerned about it. The human rights conditions in Iran are deplorable, and it is ultimately in our national interest also to promote better human rights around the world. So it will be on the agenda.
And I did forget to mention, when I recalled the example of the first face-to-face encounter of the Obama administration with Iran at The Hague recently, at the same time, the U.S. delegation did hand the Iranian delegation a letter which did express concern about the situation of Ms. Saberi and her case in jail. But I think Stephen's right. I mean, there is no dialogue. There's no venue for which to discuss human rights at this moment. So I think it's going to be a process that have to get there. If the United States comes to the table early on with a list of demands on human rights related issues, chances are that dialogue is not going to go anywhere. So this is a conundrum that faces us in our relations with many countries. Many people were angry with Secretary Clinton when she recently went to China and basically said there are other issues that we're going to put first over human rights when we talk to the Chinese government. And it brought the human rights community here in the United States up in arms. So this is a continuing challenge that every administration faces, but I would contend that unless and until we get to the table to talk to the Iranians, we will not have any dialogue on human rights. It will be impossible.
I'm sensitive to the fact that many in the human rights community are exasperated by people like me who talk about the nuclear issue, who talk about Iran and Afghanistan, give priority to those issues, want to engage Iran to try to resolve some of these issues, and meanwhile there are human rights problems. I guess the question I would ask is, under which of these conditions is human rights likely to improve in Iran? A condition in which the U.S. and Iran are adversaries, in an active hostile relationship where we are attempting to contain them, or in one in which there's engagement. My own view is that as long as the state feels threatened by a more powerful state, your chances of having flourishing human rights at home probably aren't that great, because the governments, as they are currently doing, are going to use the specter of the U.S. threat to justify crackdowns, to justify all the nasty things they want to do. So I think and that these issues also have different time agendas. I wish we could have universal human rights quickly, but I think the issue of centrifuges is going to come and pass sooner then the question of human rights is going to be resolved, even under the best of scenarios. So I think these issues are important, and I did hear my colleagues raise them. But I think we should ask, what's the best path there? And are these issues, all of them being important, nevertheless being issues that have different time horizons, that require different actions over different periods of time?
This gentleman.
So, in part in response to the overture from the Obama administration, Ahmadinejad said that he thought the U.S. should apologize for certain transgressions.
Yeah.
So the U.S. media largely conveyed to the public that this was just more propaganda. What I wonder is if you can talk about the reasons that we might not be hearing about some of the things that Iranian people might actually be upset about, like the coup in 1953, like the downing of the airliner in 1988. Why don't we hear about this in the media? Why do we hear that this is just propaganda and not legitimate gripes? I guess as a sort of follow-up, how I was hoping maybe you could comment a little bit about the paradox that so the hostage crisis in 1979, which has pretty much soured our relations, is a strange juxtaposition with incarceration of diplomats in Iraq, who we are claiming are Revolutionary Guard, whereas they were claiming that these guys were CIA. And also, I was wondering if you might feel okay.
I think we have it. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get all four of these questions down because I think we have a hard exit moment in here. So if you can put yours,
Step
and then
on
you
up
can put
and ask
yours,
one.
and then you can put yours, and then we'll get them all four. Try and be as succinct as possible because I want to give each of our panelists a chance to pick them up.
Do you want to go first?
Well, let's not use the time.
All of you pinpointed the importance of the election and how it's going to affect the future of Iran-U.S. relations. Although all of you also noticed that the supreme leader is the one who decides. But a very important point is the supreme leader is a sacred, and they don't want to use that card to negotiate with U.S. They use their president to come and do all the mistakes and step backs and step forwards. So the president does matter a lot in the Iran-U.S. relations. And Ahmadinejad had a very important sentence recently that was if Obama wants to do something, he better does it in the next 2 months, because after that, I cannot guarantee that the conditions are going to be the same. I think he wants to use that as a very important card in the following elections. And I do believe U.S. has a very important role in the outcome of the elections. Do you think the U.S. officials are using that card or thinking about it, how they can affect the elections in Iran, but by taking a step now before the elections, or are they just going to hope and wait for some outcome and then decide based on that? Thank you.
Over to you.
Oh, I have so many.
Just pick your two favorites.
I preface I'm Balkan, so I'm passionate. And I was a war correspondent, so I'm even more passionate. I want to talk about respect and collective memories. We talk about the hostage crisis, very bad, very bad. But no one in the nuclear proliferation and nuclear weaponry has mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, which the Americans backed the Iraqis. So we're surrounding them. We allowed Chemical Ali to go in. We allowed the Iraqis to slaughter them. Oh, by the way, we don't care. But you can't defend yourself. So that's one thing that really strikes a nerve. Second, let's look at economy. It is, in Iran, the largest population of educated youth in the world who have nothing to do. Suzanne, the drugs are because these kids have nothing to do and they have no way to express themselves. They're turning to heroin. You can block the borders, but until these kids get jobs, until these kids can have families, this is their only recreation. So how are we utilizing these kids? How are we helping them? How is America going in there and providing them clean energy? How are we providing them alternatives? How are we getting foreign aid in there to build businesses? So basically we're saying, what I'm hearing is, our way, we come in with this olive branch, but you can't economically help yourself. You can't protect your borders. I wouldn't be negotiating with us.
Okay, so I think we have it, and I'm going to get this last question. Thank you. We're going to get this last question. And then
my question
we
will just be really quick, and
and
it just has to do with the fact that all of you talked about just the time and patience that's needed after such a long, time of having problematic relationships. And you also all talked about kind of this Obama administration and how it's, turning over a new leaf and things. And so my question is with that time that's needed, and with, an administration that's 4 or 8 years or whatever it is, what concrete things need to happen in the next, 4 to 8 years so that we continue on this path of something different, as opposed to just abandoning this idea and saying, well, we clearly can't have good relationship, and so we'll kind of abandon this. So my question is just what concrete things need to happen so that we continue on this path.
Okay, now we're entering the lightning round, and maybe we can cheat a little bit, but I think basically it's 3 minutes apiece. And
okay.
So pick your favorite of these 4 questions, or your favorites, and go for it.
I'll start with the first one. I think essentially you were asking about the grievances, why you don't hear about the Iranian grievances in the media. Probably because it won't sell papers. Who really wants to hear about it? But I would urge you, if you go online and do some in-depth research, you will find some good analysis on this. And I think for any one of us we've talked extensively with Iranian officials over the years, and believe me, hours spent talking about the grievances that the United States has perpetrated on the Iranians. It's part of the process, and I think as soon as the U.S. and Iran officially enter negotiations, they should realize that this is going to consume a lot of the time early on in those negotiations. And I think it's an important part of the process, is to really sit down and talk with your so-called adversary and talk about how they wronged you. I think once that's done, then you can get to the next stage and imagine a future of at least learning to live with each other or agreeing to disagree about certain things. So it's an important part of the process that shouldn't be ignored. Whether or not the elections are important, I think compared to Jim and Stephen, that they're not quite as important as they do. I think essentially no matter who is elected, we're not going to see a major shift in Iranian policy, and the Supreme Leader will continue to call the shots. Would it be helpful to have one of Ahmadinejad's opponents win to turn down that fiery rhetoric a little? Probably. But I think at the end of the day, the Iranians are still going to insist on the capacity to enrich uranium on their soil for peaceful purposes. That's not going to change no matter who's elected president, and that is really the crux of the matter at this point in U.S.-Iran relations. Moving on to what concrete things need to happen next to bring the next stage forward. I think first and foremost, we really need to see a decision made at the very top of both governments that they want to engage in discussions on a broad range of issues on a sustained basis. I think we're seeing that from the United States government, from the Obama administration. They're laying the foundation for that route. I'm not seeing that being responded to by the Iranians yet. And unless and until we get there, I don't think we'll make much progress. And as I said in my early remarks, I believe the ball is now in Tehran's court. So first and foremost, I think that's what we need to see, is a strategic decision from the very top of both governments to engage.
Go ahead. All right. right, if you insist. I'll just be very brief. First of all, thank you all very much. These have been terrific questions. I wish we could carry on for a lot longer because it's been very, very interesting for us. I don't disagree with Suzanne. The leader ultimately will make the decision, but we do have to deal with the government. The government is an important player in Iran. My own argument that I've been making for the last few weeks is that I would rather the Obama administration get started now, at least at some level, and not wait for the elections. I think there are some real advantages to getting started now. First of all, you never know what's going to happen in the future that could derail the opportunity to get started. Second, if you start now while Ahmadinejad is president and he does get reelected, you've started with the guy who's there. If he does lose the election and a reformer wins the election, the reformer actually has some political cover to continue the process by saying, well, this was started under a hardline president, so, you know, this obviously has the support of the conservative establishment, and we're carrying on and we're going to take this further. So I think there's nothing to lose from getting started now. We're not going to get any breakthroughs in the next 6 weeks, which is what we have until the elections. So get started, do it modestly, do it, you know, quietly and cautiously, and don't interfere with their presidential elections. That's a fool's errand. But realize that they have a government, they have an election, they're going to have a government, and deal with it on a very simple basis. I certainly agree with your comments about understanding the dynamics of Iran and what they have been through. The Iran-Iraq war, you can't underestimate how deeply debilitating economically and physically and spiritually that was for Iran. It was a devastating experience. Close to 1 million people died. The United States was complicit. There's just no question about any of these things. And we need to own up to that. And I think one of the great things about the Obama administration is that they have demonstrated in a lot of other cases that they're prepared to live up to our own negative history, as well as trying to say we still think we can be a country that does good things in the world, and we want to do good things in the world, and that approach is going to be important with Iran as well. So I appreciate you making that point. Why don't I leave it at that and let Jim have the last?
Well, on the election, I completely agree with you, and I think that's what Obama is doing. I think Bill Burns, in our meeting with them, rejected the idea that they were going to wait until after the election, and the fact that they invited Iran to the Afghan conference is evidence that they aren't waiting. They're moving forward, but they're not going to try to game it, and I think that's wise because you're more likely to fail and fail badly. So it's better to just play it straight, and I think that's what they're doing. And I think we all agree that, you know, the Iran-Iraq war, more than the 53 coup, resonates in contemporary Iranian society. I don't know if the Iranians were going to be anxious to let America in to work with their youth, but I do imagine that over time there'll be greater economic exchange, you know, if this path continues. Coverage of the media, I do a lot in the U.S., and I do a lot on Iran, and I can tell you it's bad in both places. So no one seems to have a real advantage there. And I would expect that to continue. I guess the thing that I want to respond to is what do we do over 4 years? And part of it, you know, there's a technical answer. Well, over some period of time, not immediately, but over some period of time, we'll open up a embassy. You know, we'll have normalized relations. We'll at least open up an intersection, if not an embassy. You know, there'll be direct flights between Tehran and New York. There'll be a series of things that will meet the needs of each side. But I think this issue of time is an important one in two ways. One, unfortunately, because of all the baggage and a lack of trust, these things do take time. However, we don't have a lot of time because the centrifuges are going to continue to be pumped out year after year after year after year. And those who say this is unacceptable and a casus belli, they're going to be making that argument the greater the number of centrifuges. So it requires patience, but we have to have a sense of urgency here because the nuclear timeline continues, and it's not indefinite. It is 4 years or 6 years or 7 or 8 years where people are going to, after a certain point, are going to make an argument for an alternative policy. And the other thing I want to do is just repeat what I said before. I think it's not... Yes, time matters, but not all the time is equally important. In other words, actions early or late could matter more than action taken at some other point. I think early action is more likely to be productive and decisive than late action, because I do think Obama walks in with this image of being fundamentally different and a legitimate change agent in the eyes of Iranians. I think they are willing to give him a shot, whether that's elites or at the level of the street. And of course, there are going to be different opinions. But I don't think he can act the same way, come back 2 years or 3 years down the line and say, no, I really am the change guy. I really am new and different. Because by that point, that opportunity will be squandered. So I think there's some delicate balancing that has to go on here. And time is not neutral.
And speaking of time, we are at the moment. I hope you will join me in thanking our panel for a great set of presentations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
I thought the questions were great.
Nice to meet you.
Very good. I wish we had more time.
Yes.
Good job, traffic cop. You know, you never...
Other duties as assigned.
Some of these, I've been at things that have gotten a little dicey. So it's not necessarily